I am 94 years old. Yesterday morning, while most women my age were sipping wheat decaf coffee and staring at the telephone, praying for a call that would never come, I was doing something entirely different. I was sitting at my mahogany dining table, the one my late husband bought me for our 10th anniversary, pouring tea for two armed police officers. I was calmly signing a legally binding document that guarantees my only son. The boy I carried in my womb, the boy I stayed awake nights worrying over, will be handcuffed and thrown into the back of a squad car if his expensive wingtip shoes ever dare to step onto my front porch again. The neighbors in my quiet, manicured cul-de-sac probably think I've finally lost my mind. I can see Mrs. Higgins peeking through her floral curtains. Dementia. They whisper over their garden fences, such a tragedy, a poor, lonely mother going senile and turning on her own flesh and blood. Let them whisper, they don't know him. And they certainly don't understand the suffocating, soul-crushing reality of loving a narcissist for over 6 decades. Society tells us a very specific lie about aging and motherhood. We are fed this toxic narrative that family is absolutely everything, that a mother's love must be unconditional, a bottomless well of forgiveness. Blood is thicker than water. They parrot at you, usually right before they try to drown you in it. We are conditioned to turn the other cheek, to keep pouring from an empty cup until there is nothing left of us but dust, regret, and a faded checking account. But at 94, my bones ache when the barometer drops, and my patience has completely evaporated. I no longer have the luxury of time, nor the energy for the exhausting theatrics. I am done making excuses. I am done being a convenient emotional Aiton. And most of all, I am done being a silent prop in his grand delusional stage play. My son David, a handsome, charismatic man. Successful, articulate, the kind of guy who shakes your hand with a firm grip and always remembers your first name. To the outside world, to his colleagues, to the cashiers at the grocery store, he is the picture of the dutiful, loving son. But to me, he is a parasite wearing a tailored suit. A black hole that consumes affection, resources, and sanity, giving absolutely nothing back but anxiety and a lingering sense of worthlessness. When a mother is estranged from her child, society immediately blames the mother. What did she do to him? Was she too strict? Did she not love him enough? Nobody ever wants to admit the terrifying truth that sometimes some people are simply born with a missing piece in their soul. Cutting him off wasn't a sudden, erratic decision made in the twilight of my life. It was a slow, agonizing death of 1,000 cuts. But the brutal truth is, I should have done this exactly 15 years ago. I should have severed the cord on the dreary, rain-soaked afternoon we buried his father, because as they were lowering my husband's casket into the damp earth, David leaned over to me. He wrapped his strong arm around my trembling shoulders in a picture, perfect display of grief for the onlookers, and right there, staring at his father's grave, he whispered exactly 7 words into my ear, 7 words that froze the blood in my veins, 7 words that instantly stripped away his human mask and revealed the cold, calculating stranger living inside my son's skin. I spent the next 15 years desperately trying to convince myself I had misheard him, trying to believe it was just the grief talking. But I didn't mishear him. I will tell you exactly what those 7 words were, but not yet. Because if I told you now, you wouldn't fully grasp the sheer malice behind them. First, you need to understand the monstrous machinery of a narcissistic child. You need to understand how they systematically break you down year after year until you don't even recognize your own reflection in the mirror. And for David and me, the most effective weapon in his arsenal was always the holidays, the infamous picture-perfect American holidays. Because that is where the real nightmare always began. You don't wake up one Tuesday morning and suddenly realize your child is a narcissist. It doesn't happen like a lightning strike. It is much more insidious than that. It's a slow leak in the basement of your life, a steady, quiet drip that gradually rots the foundation of your home over 40 years, until one day the floor simply collapses beneath your feet. For decades, I was the master architect of my own delusion. I built a fortress of excuses to protect the image of the son I desperately wanted, shielding myself from the son I actually had. When he was a teenager and stole money from my purse, I told myself, he's just testing boundaries. All boys go through a rebellious phase. When he was in his 20s and wrecked his father's car because he was driving drunk, leaving his passenger with a broken collarbone, I paid the legal fees and whispered, he's just finding his way. He has a good heart. He just makes poor choices. Oh, the lies mothers tell themselves to survive the unbearable ache of disappointment. We are biologically wired for guilt. It is our factory default setting, and a narcissist like David possesses a sixth sense for locating that guilt and pressing on it like a bruised rib. David learned very early on that his natural charm, that devastating dimpled smile, was a currency. He could buy his way out of any consequence if he just played the right character, and his absolute favorite role to play was the victim. With David, nothing was ever his fault. If he failed a college course, the professor had a vendetta against him. If he was fired from a lucrative job, his boss was threatened by his intellect. If a relationship imploded, the woman was crazy and unstable. And if Arthur, my late husband, and I hesitated to dip into our hard-earned retirement savings to fund yet another of his brilliant foolproof business ventures, well, then we were unsupportive. We were suffocating his potential. He would look at me with those cold, hollow eyes and say, "Other parents believe in their kids, Mom. I guess I'm just on my own." That was his signature move, the emotional blackmail, the subtle implication that my love was somehow defective if it didn't come with a blank check attached. So I would cave. I would write the check. I would smooth things over with his father. I spent 40 years acting as the emotional shock absorber for a man who drove recklessly through other people's lives, leaving a trail of wreckage he never once looked back at. I kept hoping that if I just loved him hard enough, if I sacrificed just a little bit more, the empathy chip that was missing from his brain would suddenly click into place. But you cannot love the narcissism out of someone. You can only bleed yourself dry trying. I became so conditioned to his manipulation that I didn't even realize I was walking on eggshells in my own home. I learned to read his moods the way a sailor reads a stormy sky. I knew when to stay quiet, when to offer praise, and when to open my wallet. I rationalized that this was simply what mothering an adult child looked like. I survived the other 10 months of the year by maintaining a polite, superficial distance. He lived 3 states away, so the damage was mostly contained to frantic phone calls and emergency wire transfers. But November was when the real dread set in, because no matter how distant he had been all year, the holiday season brought out a completely different creature. A creature I came to call the holiday ghost. And his annual haunting was about to become the very thing that broke me. You know the ghost I'm talking about. He doesn't rattle chains in the attic. He rattles your checking account. He doesn't haunt the hallways. He haunts your peace of mind. For 10 months of the year, my son was practically a phantom, a figment of my imagination that only materialized as a brief text message on my birthday or a rushed 5-minute phone call when he needed someone to co-sign a loan. But when the frost set in and the grocery stores started playing Christmas carols, that's when the holiday ghost would descend upon my quiet home. The anxiety would start building the week before Thanksgiving. I would spend 3 days scrubbing floors that were already clean, buying the expensive cuts of meat he preferred, and stocking the liquor cabinet with his favorite single malt scotch. I was 85, 88, 90 years old, exhausting my frail bones to set the perfect stage for a son who saw me not as a mother, but as a seasonal photo opportunity. When the crunch of his tires hit the gravel driveway, my stomach would tie itself into a familiar, suffocating knot. He would burst through the front door, a flurry of expensive cologne, cashmere scarves, and booming, performative greetings. "Mom, you look fantastic, not a day over 60. He'd announce loudly, usually making sure the postman or a passing neighbor heard him. For the next 48 hours, I was trapped in a Norman Rockwell painting forged by a con artist. David was suddenly the epitome of the devoted son. He would insist on carving the turkey. He would pour wine for my sister. He would regale the dinner table with exaggerated stories of his corporate successes. He sucked the oxygen out of every room, making sure the spotlight was planted firmly on his charming face. And then came the most crucial part of his visit, the social media documentation. He would wrap his arm around my frail shoulders, pull me in uncomfortably tight, and hold up his smartphone. Click, a wide, blindingly fake smile for the camera. Within minutes, the photo would be uploaded to Facebook with a caption that made me nauseous to read. Nothing more important than family. Cherishing every moment with my amazing mom this Thanksgiving. Blessed the family first. The comments from his friends would roll in, praising him for being such a wonderful, attentive son. He would read them out loud, practically preening like a peacock, but the absolute second his phone went back into his pocket, the mask dropped. The smile vanished. The heavy silence returned to the living room. He would spend the rest of the evening scrolling through emails on his laptop, snapping at me if I asked the TV volume to be lowered, treating my home like a mid-tier hotel with terrible room service. By Sunday morning, the real purpose of the visit would finally reveal itself. It always started with a heavy sigh over breakfast, a subtle mention of a temporary cash flow problem at his firm, a casual joke about how expensive his daughter's private school tuition had become. He never explicitly asked. He didn't have to. He just laid out the bait, knowing my conditioned guilt would force me to bite. Before his expensive sieve backed out of my driveway, a folded check for $5,000 would be tucked neatly into his coat pocket. He would kiss my cheek, a cold, perfunctory peck, and vanish into the wind for another year. I hated the holidays. I hated the performance. But mostly, I hated myself for buying a ticket to a show every single year. I thought that was how it would be until the day I died. A transactional, empty relationship punctuated by roasted turkeys and written checks. But then, last spring, the rhythm broke. The phantom suddenly became entirely flesh and blood. David didn't just call for a holiday. He showed up on a random Tuesday in April, and he brought his suitcases. And what he did next almost convinced me that miracles were actually real. It was a Tuesday in late April, the kind of unremarkable, dreary spring morning where the only thing on my agenda was watching the Cardinals at the bird feeder and finishing a crossword puzzle. There were no holidays in sight, no birthdays, no obvious reasons for the holiday ghost to materialize. But at 10,000, a sleek black SUV pulled into my gravel driveway. I watched through the sheer curtains, my coffee cup trembling slightly as David stepped out. He didn't have his usual frantic performative energy. Tired, older, deflated, and he was pulling 2 large leather suitcases from the trunk. My heart instantly seized in my chest. What legal trouble is he in now? Who is he hiding from? How much is this going to cost me? I braced myself for the incoming storm as I unlocked the deadbolt. But the storm never came. Instead, David walked into my foyer, dropped his heavy bags on the hardwood floor, and did something he hadn't done since he was a little boy scraping his knee on the pavement. He wrapped his arms around me, buried his face in my shoulder, and just held on tight. Not for a camera, not for an audience. He just stood there in my quiet hallway, breathing in the scent of my lavender soap, and let out a long, shaky sigh. "I'm sorry, Mom," he mumbled into my cardigan, his voice uncharacteristically thick. "I'm just so sorry for everything." I stood frozen, my frail hands hovering awkwardly over his back. I didn't know what game we were playing. I didn't know the rules to this one. Over the next 2 weeks, the ground shifted completely beneath my feet. The prodigal son had returned, and it seemed he had finally brought his conscience with him. He didn't ask for a dime. He didn't complain about the spotty Wi-Fi in the guest room or the lack of organic groceries in my fridge. Instead, I woke up the very next morning to the smell of fresh coffee brewing. I walked into the kitchen to find him at the stove, making eggs with a white bakery box sitting on the counter. "I remembered you loved the peach tarts from that little place on Main Street." He smiled softly, sliding a plate toward me. He spent the following days acting like the son I had prayed for during 40 years of Sunday services. He fixed the loose handrail on the front porch that I had been terrified of tripping over. He cleaned out the gutters. He sat with me on the patio in the evenings, actually listening to my stories about his father without checking his expensive watch or interrupting to talk about himself. One night, over cups of chamomile tea in the dimly lit kitchen, the tears finally came. Real tears tracking down his 50-something-year-old face. "Year-old face, I've been a terrible son, Mom," he wept, looking down at his trembling hands. "I got so caught up in the rat race, the money, the image. I forgot what actually matters. You're 94. Time is running out. And I can't bear the thought of losing you before I make things right. I want to be here. I want to take care of you. I am a cynical woman. I am a hardened woman. But God help me, I am still a mother." And right then, looking at my graying son weeping at my table, the thick, protective walls around my heart simply crumbled. The decades of resentment, the unpaid debts, the agonizing holidays, they all washed away in the flood of his apologies. I allowed myself to believe the most dangerous, intoxicating lie in the English language: he has changed. I surrendered completely to the illusion. We started making plans. Beautiful, comforting plans about him moving in permanently, about us spending my twilight years together in peace. But I was a desperate old fool, blinded by a mother's terminal hope. Because the peach tarts, the tears, and the fixed handrails weren't acts of love. They were an investment, an appraisal, and I was about to find out exactly what he was calculating. At 94 years old, you know death is sitting in the waiting room. You can hear him out there, casually flipping through the magazines. I made my peace with that a long time ago. But loneliness. Loneliness is the unwanted guest who has already moved into the spare bedroom. It follows you down the hallway, it sits across from you at the dinner table, and it suffocates you in the quiet hours of the night. So, when David offered to chase the loneliness away, I didn't just unlock the door for him, I took the damn thing off its hinges. For 3 glorious, intoxicating weeks, my house felt like a home again. The heavy, oppressive silence that used to echo off the floral wallpaper was completely replaced by the comforting hum of baseball games on the television and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. David insisted on doing all the cooking. He even brought Arthur's old, heavy armchair down from the dusty attic, placing it right next to mine in the living room. "I'm putting my condo on the market next week, Mom," he announced one evening, casually swirling a glass of Merlot as a fire crackled in the hearth. "I'm coming home. You shouldn't be managing this massive property by yourself anymore. Let me take care of you. It's my turn." Do you have any idea how intoxicating those words are to an elderly woman living alone? The secret terror of a midnight fall down the stairs, the anxiety of leaving a stove burner on, the fear of dying and not being found for days. All of it vanished into the thin air. I felt a profound, foolish sense of vindication. See, I wanted to shout to the universe. A mother's love never fails. He finally grew up. The empathy was there all along. It just took a lifetime to bloom. I let my guard down completely. The ironclad fortress I had painstakingly built around my emotions over 40 years was dismantled in less than a month. He began taking on my little burdens. It started innocently enough, wrapped in the guise of extreme filial piety. "Let me grab the mail, Mom." I was so tired from carrying the sheer weight of my own existence, that I eagerly let him strap it to his broad shoulders. I thought I was leaning on my son. I didn't realize I was handing him the very rope he planned to tie me up with. Because here is the psychological truth about a narcissist: they can only hold their breath underwater for so long before they have to come up for air. The mask they wear is incredibly heavy. Eventually, the muscles in their face get exhausted from holding that fake, loving smile. For David, the mask finally slipped on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had shuffled into the kitchen to make myself a cup of Earl Grey tea while he was upstairs taking a shower. He had left his expensive leather briefcase open on the kitchen island. I didn't mean to snoop. I have never been that kind of mother, and at 94, my eyesight is failing me anyway, with early stage macular degeneration. But the bold, black, capitalized letters stamped across the top of a thick manila folder protruding from his bag were absolutely impossible to miss. It wasn't a brochure for in-home nursing care. It wasn't a real estate listing for his condo. It was a thick stack of freshly drafted legal documents. And as I put on my reading glasses and squinted at the first page, the warm kitchen suddenly felt like a walk-in freezer. I put on my reading glasses, my hand shaking so violently that the wire frames rattled against my cheekbones. I slid the thick stack of papers out of the manila folder. The first page wasn't a listing for his condo. It was a legal document, printed on heavy, watermarked paper. At the very top, in bold, unforgiving letters, it read, "General Durable Power of Attorney." My eyes darted down the page, skimming through the dense legal jargon. There, on line 4, was David's name, listed as my sole agent and attorney, in fact. The document, once signed, would grant him absolute, unchecked control over my bank accounts, my investments, my medical decisions, and my real estate. My breath caught in my throat. It felt as though someone had just poured a bucket of ice water down my spine. But that wasn't even the worst of it. I flipped to the second document. It was a formal letter of intent from a massive commercial development firm headquartered in Chicago. As I read the paragraphs, the room began to spin. Apparently, while I was busy doing crossword puzzles and watching the birds, the city council had quietly reasoned the land surrounding my quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac. My quaint 2-acre property sitting dangerously close to the new highway expansion was no longer just a residential lot. It was prime commercial real estate, and the number printed at the bottom of the developer's letter wasn't just a comfortable retirement sum. It was generational wealth, a multi-million-dollar buyout. I was sitting on a gold mine, and I was the only person who didn't know it. But David knew. Oh, David absolutely knew. Underneath the developer's letter was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. A glossy, high-resolution brochure for a place called Oak Crest Estates. It sounded like a luxury resort, but the pictures told a very different story. It was a nursing home. And he hadn't bookmarked the independent living section. A bright yellow sticky note protrude from the pages outlining their advanced memory care and secure lockdown ward, the place where elderly people go when they are deemed a danger to themselves, the place where they take away your shoes with laces and lock the doors from the outside. Suddenly, the last 3 weeks flashed before my eyes in horrifying clarity. The entire picture snapped into focus, and the sheer cruelty of it made me physically gag over my kitchen sink. The prodigal son hadn't returned for redemption. He had returned for a hostile takeover. He didn't fix the loose handrail on the porch out of love. He took pictures of it to document that my home was a fall risk and a safety hazard. He didn't take over my mail and utility bills to be helpful. He was establishing a paper trail to prove to a judge that I was mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. The tears, the apologies, the peach tarts. It was all a meticulously choreographed performance to establish himself as my sole, devoted caregiver. He needed to prove I was slipping. He needed me, declared incompetent, so he could sign that power of attorney, legally force me into a locked-down memory ward, and sell my home to the developers before I even knew what hit me. I wasn't a mother to him. I was just a 94-year-old squatter sitting on his winning lottery ticket. A single tear rolled down my wrinkled cheek, but it wasn't born of sadness. It was born of a white-hot, terrifying rage, the kind of rage that only a mother who has been bled dry can feel. Suddenly, the pipes in the walls groaned. The water from the upstairs shower abruptly shut off. Heavy, familiar footsteps began thudding across the floorboards directly above my head. He was out of the shower. He was coming downstairs, and I was standing right in the middle of the kitchen, holding the very blueprints of my own demise in my trembling hands. The footsteps coming down the oak staircase were heavy, rhythmic, and entirely too confident. A younger, weaker version of me might have panicked. The mother I was 3 weeks ago would have scrambled to shove the papers back into his leather briefcase, terrified of upsetting him, terrified of ruining the beautiful illusion we had just built. But I didn't move. At 94 years old, I have survived the Great Depression, the loss of a husband, and a lifetime of subtle emotional warfare. I was far too old to cower in my own kitchen. I stood perfectly still, my spine as straight as my aching vertebrae would allow, gripping the manila folder against my chest like a shield. David walked into the kitchen, vigorously rubbing his damp hair with a towel, whistling a cheerful off-key tune. When he lowered the towel and saw me standing there, the whistling stopped dead. His eyes instantly locked onto the thick stack of watermarked paper in my trembling hands. For a fraction of a second, I saw a raw, unadulterated panic flash across his face. But narcissists are incredibly agile predators. They pivot faster than the human eye can track. Within a heartbeat, the panic vanished, replaced by a patronizing, pitying smile. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with syrupy concern. He took a slow step toward me, holding his hands up like he was approaching a skittish horse. "What are you doing digging through my work bag? You know you get confused when you don't take your afternoon nap. Let me have those, sweetheart. Your memory is just playing tricks on you again. Gaslighting." The ultimate weapon of the emotional abuser. When caught red-handed, they don't apologize. They immediately try to convince you that your own reality is defective. "I am old, David," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, not blind, "and I am certainly not stupid. Oak Crest Estates, a commercial beaut for $3 million. Tell me, when they lock me in the memory care ward, were you planning to visit on Thanksgiving or just send a postcard from your new yacht?" The temperature in the room plummeted. The patronizing smile slowly melted off his face, revealing the cold, hardened granite underneath. The charming, doting sun evaporated into thin air. I was finally looking at the real David. The transformation was terrifying. It is a phenomenon psychologists call narcissistic rage. When you puncture their delusion, when you hold up a mirror to their true intentions, they do not feel remorse. They feel cornered, and a cornered narcissist is a vicious thing. He didn't yell at first. He just stepped closer, using his 6-foot frame to physically intimidate me, towering over my frail, stooped body. "You selfish old bat," he hissed, the venom in his voice making me flinch. "You are sitting on a gold mine, hoarding this massive house while you rot away in it. Dad left me pennies. I've busted my ass for decades, and what do I have to show for it? Nothing. This property is my birthright." "It is my home," I fired back, clutching the papers tighter. "I am perfectly capable of living here. You're a liability," he roared, slamming his fist down on the kitchen island so hard the teacups rattled in their saucers. "You're going to fall, break your hip, and the state will eat the estate anyway. I am trying to protect my inheritance." "You're clearly senile, Mom. Look at you. You're shaking. You're paranoid." He violently snatched the folder right out of my hands, the edge of the thick paper slicing a thin paper cut across my knuckle. "I didn't want to do this the hard way," he sneered, tossing his towel onto the floor. "But you leave me no choice. I'm calling my lawyer in the morning. I'll have Adult Protective Services here by Friday to evaluate you. A judge will take one look at your age and grant me guardianship in a heartbeat. Pack a bag, Mom. You're leaving this house one way or another." He stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the heavy mahogany front door behind him so violently the framed pictures in the hallway shook. I was left completely alone in the deafening silence, a drop of blood welling up on my knuckle. My own son had just declared war on my freedom. He thought he had me checkmated. He thought I was just a fragile, terrified old woman who would simply cry and submit to his authority. But he made one catastrophic miscalculation. When he looked at my trembling hands and my stooped posture, he saw an easy mark, a frail, senile widow who would simply collapse under the weight of his intimidation. He forgot that, long before I was a 94-year-old woman in a knitted cardigan, I was the woman who balanced the family ledgers, managed the crises, and quietly cleaned up his messes for half a century. I looked down at the tiny bead of blood on my knuckle where the paper had sliced my skin. It was a fitting metaphor. It was time to finally sever the blood tie. I didn't reach for a tissue to wipe my tears. I didn't have any left to shed. Instead, I reached for the telephone. Narcissists rely on your paralysis. They bank on the fact that you will be too humiliated, too grief-stricken, or too confused to fight back. but clarity is a terrifyingly powerful weapon, and in that moment my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I demanded a same-day appointment. I sat in his sterile office and demanded a comprehensive cognitive assessment. I drew the clock faces, I repeated the strings of words, I answered every psychological metric they threw at me. I walked out of that clinic an hour later with a signed medical affidavit declaring my mind completely sound and my faculties entirely intact. My second call was to my late husband's estate attorney. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in a downtown law firm, sliding Dr. Evans's affidavit across the polished mahogany desk. And then, with a voice that didn't waver once, I systematically dismantled my son's entire future. "Revoke every previous power of attorney," I instructed the lawyer, my tone purely transactional. "Draft a new will. I am liquidating the estate, the house, the investments, the antique silver. Everything is going into an irrevocable trust designated for a local women's shelter. My son, David, is to be completely disinherited." The lawyer, a sharp man in his 60s, raised an eyebrow. "Eleanor, if you leave him entirely out of the will, he might contest it in probate court, claiming you forgot him in your old age." "I am not forgetting him," I replied coldly. "Leave him exactly $1. Let it be permanently recorded in the legal archives of this state that I remembered my son perfectly well, and I deemed him worth exactly 100 pennies. We didn't stop there. We drafted an ironclad cease and desist order. We filed a formal trespassing notice with the local police precinct, the very document I signed at my dining room table yesterday morning. If he called, it was harassment. If he showed up, it was a criminal offense. I was building a fortress and I was pulling up the drawbridge forever, but I won't lie to you and tell you it felt like a triumph. There was no victory parade playing in my head as I drove home that afternoon. When I finally unlocked my front door and stepped into the deafeningly quiet foyer, the adrenaline abruptly left my body. My knees buckled and I sank right down onto the hardwood floor. I sat there in my heavy winter coat, clutching my purse to my chest, and I wept from a place so deep inside my soul I didn't know it existed. It was a funeral. I wasn't just signing legal papers, I was putting a permanent bullet into the hope that I would ever have a loving son. I was accepting the brutal reality that I would age alone, get sick alone, and eventually die alone. The societal shame, the unnatural grief of a mother executing her own child's exile. It felt like taking a cheese grater to my own heart. But the weekend arrived, and with it came the true test of my boundaries. Because on Friday morning, just as he had threatened, David didn't just show up at my door. He brought company, and what happened on my front porch that morning would change the trajectory of the rest of my life. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, mocking spring breeze. Exactly at 9,000 am, David's sleek SUV pulled into my driveway. But he wasn't alone. A nondescript gray sedan parked right behind him, and out stepped a woman in a practical beige pantsuit, carrying a heavy clipboard. Adult Protective Services. David marched up the porch steps, his face arranged in a mask of deep, agonizing concern. He knocked gently. "Mom, it's David. Please open the door, sweetheart. I brought someone to help us figure things out. I didn't cower in the living room. I didn't weep. I simply unlatched the deadbolt, opened the heavy mahogany door just a few inches, and left the brass chain firmly secured. "Mrs. Miller?" the woman in the pantsuit asked, using her gentlest, most condescending customer service voice. "I'm with the Department of Aging. Your son has expressed some very serious concerns about your cognitive decline and your ability to live in this large home safely. We just want to ask you a few questions." I didn't let her finish. I slid a crisp manila envelope through the crack in the door. "Inside," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning, "you will find a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation dated 2 days ago, signed by the Chief of Geriatrics at Mercy Hospital, declaring me of sound mind. You will also find a copy of an irrevocable trust, proving I no longer own this property. My estate does. And finally, you will find a legally binding trespass order against the man standing next to you." The woman blinked, stunned. She opened the envelope, her eyes scanning Dr. Evans's signature. The professional concern on her face instantly vanished, replaced by the grim realization that she had been weaponized by a greedy heir. She turned to David, who had gone completely pale. "Mr. Miller," she said sharply, "if this medical assessment is accurate, you have filed a false report. I suggest you leave this property immediately before she calls the police." He didn't scream this time. He just stared at me through the crack in the door, his eyes completely hollow, stripped of all his power. I closed the door quietly until it clicked, slid the deadbolt home, and watched through the peephole as he got into his car and drove out of my life forever. The immediate aftermath of cutting off a toxic child is not a celebration. It is a terrifying, breathless vacuum. For the first 2 weeks, I suffered from what I can only describe as emotional phantom limb syndrome. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. When you spend 40 years addicted to the chaotic roller coaster of a narcissist, peace feels dangerously like boredom. You are detoxing from the adrenaline of abuse. But slowly, beautifully, the anatomy of peace began to reveal itself to me. It started with a cup of coffee. I realized I could sit in my kitchen at 6:40 a.m., staring out the window, without mentally calculating how much money I would have to give away to keep the peace that day. I realized I could leave my mail on the counter without fear of someone plotting to steal my independence. Society looks at a 94-year-old woman living entirely alone, estranged from her only child, and they feel a profound, misplaced pity. They think my life is a tragedy. They don't understand that this solitude is the most expensive luxury I have ever purchased. I would rather die entirely alone in my own bed, in a quiet, empty house, than take my last breath in a locked-down memory ward, surrounded by the vultures waiting to pick my bones clean. I am finally safe, but as I sit here now, bathed in this profound peace, I am haunted by a single inescapable question. Why did I wait until I was 94? The signs were always there. The cruelty was always there. But the absolute, undeniable proof of the monster I had raised was given to me 15 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday in November. It is time to tell you about the funeral. It is time to tell you about the 7 words he whispered over his father's casket. The 7 words that should have ended this entire nightmare before it ever began. 15 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of wet earth and crushed lilies, I stood at the edge of my husband's open grave. Arthur and I had been married for 45 years. He was a good, quiet man who worked too hard and loved too deeply. Half of my soul was in that polished wooden box. It was raining, that slow, miserable, bone-chilling drizzle that seems to seep right into your joints. The cemetery was dotted with black umbrellas. Friends, neighbors, and former colleagues stood in respectful, heavy silence. And right beside me, playing the role of the devoted, grief-stricken son to absolute perfection, was David. He stepped close to me. He wrapped his strong, heavy arm tightly around my trembling shoulders. I remember the soft murmurs of sympathy rippling through the crowd behind us. "What a good boy," I heard Mrs. Higgins whisper. "Thank God Eleanor has him to lean on. She would never survive this alone." I leaned into his chest, shutting my eyes, desperate for the comfort only a child can provide to a newly widowed mother. He lowered his head. His lips brushed against my ear, hidden by the high, stiff collar of my black morning coat. I waited for him to tell me he loved me. I waited for him to say that we would get through this devastating loss together. Instead, right as his father's casket hit the bottom of the grave with a hollow, agonizing thud, my only son whispered exactly 7 words. "Make sure you don't spend my inheritance, not our money." Not his father's legacy, his inheritance. I froze. The breath left my lungs in a violent, freezing rush. I pulled away slightly and looked up at his face, desperately expecting to see a twisted joke, or perhaps the delirious, confused rambling of a grieving man. But his eyes were completely clear, cold, calculating, and fixed intently on the horizon. He wasn't mourning the loss of a father. He was auditing an estate. I spent the next 15 years burying that memory under a mountain of rationalizations. I spent 15 years making excuses, telling myself I had misheard him over the sound of the rain, or that he was just worried about how I would survive financially. But the brutal truth is, the monster was always there, hiding in plain sight, just waiting for me to become frail enough to devour. If you are listening to this, if you are a mother or a father sitting in a quiet house right now, making excuses for an estranged, narcissistic child who treats you like an inconvenience or an atom, hear me now. Stop pouring your unconditional love into a black hole. Society will tell you to forgive them. Society will tell you to keep the peace, to leave the door unlocked, to write the checks, and to smile through the pain for the holiday photos. But society will not be there holding your hand when they strip you of your dignity, legally seize your assets, and lock you in a facility where nobody even knows your favorite kind of tea. You do not owe them your sanity. You do not owe them the estate you spent a lifetime bleeding to build. If your presence in their life is entirely conditional on what you can provide for them financially, then you are not a parent to them. You are a hostage. Set the ironclad boundaries. Call the lawyer. Change the will. Cut the cord. Yes, the silence that follows will be terrifying at first. The unnatural grief of mourning a child who is still walking the earth will try to drown you. But I promise you, on the other side of that terrible storm is a profound, unshakable peace. I am 94 years old. My house is completely quiet this morning. The phone isn't ringing with manufactured crises. There are no performative visitors at the door. I am entirely, unapologetically alone. And for the first time in 40 years, I am completely safe.